Hi Donna. For those that missed your talk, can you please summarise your presentation in a few sentences?
So today I showed some exciting ultrasound videos that showed that preterm infants breastfeed and move their tongue and suck in the same way as term infants. However, they use a very much weaker vacuum, and what that translates to is lower milk volumes being removed from the breast. So of course, for the preterm infant, that's not good for their growth. And so what we did today was discuss ways in which we could increase milk transfer from the breast during breastfeeding for the preterm infant.
Okay, great, thank you. You said today in the talk that the benefits of fewer milk are amplified in preterm infants. Can you please talk us through some of them?
So some of the recent studies are quite exciting, and they've shown that just by feeding human milk to the preterm infant, you can change the actual structure of the developing brain, and then that translates into memory, cognitive function and motor function in 7-year-old children. So it has this amazing effect not only on how we behave, but how we develop the brain, for example. And then there's another nice study that's shown that feeding any human milk actually grows the baby's lean tissue or their muscle, and more muscle means better brain processing. So feeding these children milk actually programs them for better health later in life.
God, makes me pleased I breastfed. So you talked a little bit about the new evolutionary field of Darwinian dentistry. Can you kind of please tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so what's been becoming apparent is that most of our bone structure is modelled due to the stress we put on it. So the actual mechanics of breastfeeding are believed to optimally form our nasomaxillary complex, for example, and our jaw and our mandible. And that also forms a nice broad palate, gives us good dentition. So breastfeeding obviously reduces the risk of malocclusion. So this is very apparent. If we look at prehistoric skulls, we don't see narrow palates or high-arched palates. We see these broad palates with good dentition. So the very act of breastfeeding moulds our face, if you like, and our facial structures so that we have good dentition, that we have good airways, they're not becoming obstructed. So it's quite an exciting practice, if you like, that dentists are particularly getting on board with.
Yeah, it really does confirm that breast milk is more than food.
Exactly
you also
right.
connected it to ADHD breastfeeding. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
So it kind of expands from that Darwinian dentistry evolutionary theory in that if breastfeeding develops our nasomaxillary structures, and therefore children are less likely to have disordered sleep breathing, for example, and that's related to ADHD behaviours. Studies have shown that longer duration of breastfeeding actually is associated with less ADHD. And so our preterm infant, who's very vulnerable and it's very difficult for them to breastfeed, are at risk or higher risk due to lower breastfeeding rates of these symptoms. So it's rather like a domino effect, if you like. So it's an interesting field, and there are obviously other things that breastfeeding provides that may be affecting that as well, such as the microbiome and sucking habits.
Okay, great, thank you. Slightly bigger one. What would you say is the most groundbreaking work you've done to date?
That's a really hard one to answer. So I think it's been the journey of bringing ultrasound into lactation to see inside of the breast, for example. So we looked at the anatomy and that changed, which led us to look at the sucking dynamics that we've been looking at today and talking about today, right through to looking at the gastric emptying of the preterm infant and the body composition using ultrasound as a non-invasive tool. So I think the whole journey is an exciting one and seems to be never-ending for me.
Limitless, just keep going. I suppose that kind of leads perfectly onto my final question, which is, you know, what does the next few years hold for your research and what you hope to achieve?
Well, what we do in our group is we combine multiple ways of looking at things and measures. So we don't just look at one thing at a time. So now we're tackling the suck, swallow, breathe coordination, which is believed to be an issue with preterm infants. So we're looking at that in more depth, and we're looking at changes or maturation of breastfeeding in the preterm infant over time. So what that will do will provide us a really solid foundation for developing interventions that are much more likely to help these vulnerable infants and their mothers to feed their babies more milk and be able to experience breastfeeding.
Brilliant. Well, good luck with it all.
Thank you.